This vignette about J. Edward Gas Addicks is from the podcast All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 49, White Collar Crime, which you can find wherever you listen to podcasts. Pop Civics Quiz. What's the 17th Amendment of the United States Constitution? Nope, prohibition was the 18th Amendment. The women's voting rights was the 19th Amendment. The 17th Amendment is the one that allows U.S. citizens to vote for their own United States senators. Ratified in 1912, it superseded Article 1, Section 3, Clauses 1 and 2 of the Constitution, under which senators were elected by state legislatures. The 6-year term for a senator has remained a constant. Each state, regardless of size, is entitled to 2 senators as part of the Connecticut Compromise between the small and large states. This contrasted with the House of Representatives, a body elected by popular vote, and was described as an uncontroversial decision. At the time, founding father James Wilson, the later first professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania, he's buried at Christ Church Burial Ground. Anyway, he was the sole advocate of popularly electing the Senate. His proposal was defeated 10-1. The longer terms and avoidance of popular election turned the Senate into a body that could counter the populism of the House, which is dismissed and reassembled every 2 years. That's why every congressional session has a number, currently the 118th Congress. State legislatures retained the theoretical right to instruct their senators to vote for or against proposals, thus giving the states both direct and indirect representation in the federal government. Members of the Constitutional Convention considered the Senate to be parallel to the British House of Lords as an upper house containing, quote, the better men of society, end quote, but improved upon as they would be conscientiously chosen by the upper houses of state legislatures for fixed terms and not merely inherited for life, as in the British system, subject to a monarch's arbitrary expansion. After the first group of senators was elected to the first Congress, 1789 to 1791, they were divided into 3 classes, as nearly equal in size as possible, by lot. It was also decided that each state's senators would be assigned to 2 different classes. Those senators grouped in the first class had their term expire after only 2 years. Those senators in the second class had their term expire after only 4 years instead of 6. Now, after this, all senators from those states have been elected to 6-year terms. And as new states have joined the Union, their Senate seats have been assigned to 2 of the 3 classes, maintaining each grouping as nearly equal in size as possible. In this way, election is staggered. Approximately 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election every 2 years, but the entire body is never up for re-election in the same year. These 2-year intervals between elections are known as Class 1, 2, and 3. The senatorial elections of 2022 were Class 1 elections. In Philadelphia, Federalist New York Senator Philip Schuyler drew the lot for the first Class 1 of senators, the ones who initially served only 2 years. You probably know about Schuyler's 3 oldest daughters, Angelica, Eliza, and Peggy. In the 19th century, many people felt that senatorial elections were bought and sold and changed hands for favors and sums of money rather than because of the competence of the candidate. Between 1857 and 1900, the Senate investigated 3 elections over corruption, and in more than a century of legislative elections of U.S. senators, 10 cases were contested for allegations of impropriety. Electoral deadlocks were another issue. Because state legislatures were charged with deciding whom to appoint as senators, the system relied on their ability to agree. Some states could not, and thus delayed sending senators to Congress. In a few cases, the system broke down to the point where states completely lacked representation in the Senate. Deadlocks started to become an issue in the 1850s, with a deadlocked Indiana legislature allowing a Senate seat to sit vacant for 2 years. The tipping point came in 1865 with the election of John P. Stockton, Democrat, New Jersey, which happened after the New Jersey legislature changed its rules regarding the definition of a quorum and was thus elected by plurality instead of by absolute majority. Eventually, legislative elections held in a state's set of election years were perceived to have become so dominated by the business of picking senators that the state's choice for senator distracted the electorate from all other pertinent issues. Sometimes, the policy stances and qualifications of state legislative candidates were ignored by voters who were more interested in the indirect Senate election. New Mexico and Arizona were admitted to the Union in January and February of 1912 as the 47th and 48th states. The conference report that would become the 17th Amendment was approved by the Senate in a 42-36 vote on 12 April 1912, and by the House 238-39 with 110 not voting on 13 May 1912. 9 days later, Massachusetts was the first state to ratify the proposed amendment. Less than 11 months later, on 8 April 1913, Connecticut was the 36th state to ratify the amendment, and it became law. Utah had rejected the amendment, and 5 states added their votes afterwards, the most recent being Rhode Island in 2014. Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Mississippi, South Carolina, Virginia, and of course Alaska and Hawaii have never ratified the amendment. The state of Delaware rejected the amendment in 1913, but finally passed it 97 years later in 2010. It was Delaware that suffered through one of the most egregious attempts at acquiring a seat in the Senate, when Philadelphia industrialist John Edward Charles O'Sullivan Addicks spent years and hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to buy a senatorial seat. John Edward Addicks, Addicks, was born in Philadelphia on 21 November 1841. To John E.C. O'Sullivan Addicks, 1818 to 1883, and Margaret McLeod Turner Addicks, 1822 to 1898. They lived at 1102 Girard Street. They're both interred in Section G of Laurel Hill East. He was a lineal descendant of Daniel O'Sullivan Baird of Dunderry Castle, County Cork, Ireland, who was leader of the 16th century Munster religious wars against Elizabeth of England. He was the grandson of John Edward Charles Addicks, German consul to Philadelphia. His great-grandmother was Lady Arabella Galbraith of Scotland. Addicks was educated in Philadelphia public schools, and he entered the dry goods business for 5 years before he joined forces with Philadelphia grain and flour merchant Levi Knowles, 1813 to 1898. In 1856, when he was 15 years old, Knowles is interred at Laurel Hill East in Section K. It was Addicks who introduced Minnesota spring wheat to eastern farmers, for whom wheat had previously been harvested in other seasons. In 1864, at age 23, he married Laura Watson Butcher, 1842-1867. Daughter of wealthy Philadelphia businessman Washington Butcher, 1814 to 1873, Laurel Hill East, K76. He was director of the Pennsylvania Railroad, the Girard Bank, and other local businesses, along with being a deacon in the First Baptist Church at Broad and Arch. Addicks and Laura had one daughter, Florence, 1866 to 1942. But Laura died in 1867 at age 24, leaving Addicks with an infant daughter. He then married Laura's younger sister, Rosalie, 1849 to 1907. He did that 2 years later in 1869. This marriage lasted for almost 30 years, but it ended in a rancorous divorce in 1898 after Addicks was accused of adultery, and Rosalie even took back her maiden name of Butcher. Both sisters are buried with their parents. In 1898, soon after his divorce from Rosalie, Addicks married a third time, this time quietly in Claymont, Delaware, to Mrs. Ida Carr Wilson, 1850 to 1931, a widow whom he had apparently been seeing since the year after her first husband died in 1886. Ida had been named as the correspondent in the divorce. The Baltimore Sun said, quote, "A prominent Wilmington clergyman will probably officiate," end quote. When Ida died in 1931, she was interred with her first husband in Wilmington. Addicks lost money in the Panic of 1873, which bankrupted more than 100 of the nation's railroad firms and caused more than 18,000 business failures in the country. He took a chance. He diversified his wealth into real estate and railroads, along with purchasing some up-and-coming natural gas franchises in several cities. Now, natural gas had been discovered in the Americas in 1626. In 1816, the first private residence in the United States illuminated by gas belonged to William Henry, a coppersmith at 200 Lombard Street in Philadelphia. That same year, 1816, Baltimore became the first American city with a business lit by natural gas lamps, Philadelphians Rembrandt and Rubens Peale's Museum. A year later, the city hired Peale's Gaslight Company of Baltimore to begin laying gas mains and erecting street lamps. In 1821, William Hart successfully dug the first natural gas well at Fredonia, New York in the United States. This led to the formation of the Fredonia Gaslight Company. At the same time, companies in other cities, such as Boston Gaslight in 1822 and New York Gaslight Company in 1825, began feeding the fire. The city of Philadelphia created the first municipally owned natural gas distribution venture in 1836, the year that Laurel Hill East was founded. In the mid-19th century, Americans were making a big switch away from candles and lanterns. Before the discovery of natural gas, whale oil had dominated the world for both illumination and mechanical lubrication. The whaling industry peaked about the 1820s, before its market was taken over by natural gas. In the second half of the 19th century, the manufactured fuel gas industry diversified from lighting to include heat and cooking uses. The threat from electrical light in the later 1870s and 1880s drove this trend strongly. The gas industry did not give up the gas lighting market to electricity immediately, as the invention of the Welsbach mantle, a refractory mesh bag heated to incandescence by a mostly non-luminous flame within, dramatically increased the efficiency of gas lighting. Acetylene was also used from about 1898 for gas cooking and gas lighting, like the carbide lamp on a smaller scale. In the 1890s, pipelines from natural gas fields in Texas and Oklahoma were built to Chicago and other cities, and natural gas was used to supplement manufactured fuel gas supplies, eventually completely displacing it. Addicks was a shrewd and somewhat ruthless businessman who could enter a market where there were numerous competitors and turn them into a monopoly. He acquired two nicknames along the way, the Napoleon of Gas and simply Gas Addicks. He bought a gasworks in Jersey City, and in 1882 was a principal organizer of the Chicago Gasworks. 2 years later, he formed the Bay State Gasworks in Boston, which absorbed competitors from surrounding towns. He bent the Massachusetts legislature to his will, and he made vast sums of money with very little capital investment. Mayor Matthews of Boston finally forced him out of the state, saying, quote, "You could search all the combinations and trusts that infest our land today, and you could not find a sharper, brighter, more acute, and more successful corporation wrecker than J. Edward Addicks." He also acquired a controlling interest in the Brooklyn Gas Company. In 1889, Addicks more or less discovered his next-door neighbor Delaware, and he made 3 purchases: an 8-acre estate for himself in Claymont, 20 miles south of Philadelphia, the gas market for Wilmington, and several members of the state legislature to pass legislation very beneficial to his company. By watering stocks and manipulations and judicious investments in Siberian railroad stocks, he continued to build his fortune. One day, he decided that he would like to be a senator from Delaware, although he knew virtually nothing about the state except that it had only 3 counties, Newcastle, Sussex, and Kent, and 52 state senators and representatives, which was an affordable number to purchase, if necessary. He didn't know many people in the state. He also didn't know that this was DuPont turf. After the 1888 election, won by DuPont associate Republican Anthony Higgins, Addicks told the world he would allow himself to be elected to the Senate. There wasn't a big response. Delaware natives scoffed at the carpetbagger with the high silk hat and the fur overcoat who wanted to represent them to the nation. Now, because of the class system, no Delaware senatorial seat came up for voting in the 1890 elections. But by 1892, when Delaware's other Senate seat came up, Addicks had assembled a faction that he named the Union Republicans. He had split the Republican Party. Addicks offered $10,000 for each legislator who would vote for him. He spent more than $100,000, and he gained control of the Republican organizations in the downstate counties, Kent and Sussex, by paying taxes for people who were not qualified to vote because of their debt. Only Northern County, Newcastle, was solidly in DuPont's corner. Henry DuPont, a Civil War hero, had been at work. He even wrote a letter to his friend President Benjamin Harrison and requested that Watson Sperry, editor of the Wilmington Morning News, be given a federal appointment that would take the independent editor out of Delaware politics. Sperry had been supporting another Republican by the name of Massey for senator. Such a factional dispute could hurt Higgins just when Addicks was mounting his attack. President Harrison, a Republican, took the hint. He made Sperry a special envoy on a secret mission to Persia, and Higgins was reelected. By 1894, Addicks was listed in the records as being president of Bay State Gas Company of Delaware, the Bay State Gas Company of New Jersey, the Bay State Gas Company of Massachusetts, the Boston Gaslight Company, the Dorchester Gaslight Company, and the South Boston Gaslight Company. He redoubled his efforts for the Senate. He poured at least $150,000 into the campaign, and this time the Republicans took over the Assembly. This gave Addicks bragging rights that without his monetary infusion, the Republicans would never have taken back Delaware. He felt this had earned him the right to a seat in the U.S. Senate. But he only controlled 6 of the 19 Republican votes. The other 13 were committed to Henry A. DuPont, who also had his eyes set on a Senate seat. None of Addicks's or DuPont's representatives would budge, and the 11 minority Democrats refused to help either man. Thus, in 1894, no one from Delaware was elected to the U.S. Senate, and from March 1895 to January 1897, Delaware had only one U.S. Senator, Democrat George Gray. In 1897, a new senator had to be picked by the legislature. Addicks still controlled 6 votes, not enough to elect him, but enough to check a clear Republican majority and prevent anyone's election. Higgins was then made to step aside, and Colonel Henry DuPont again announced his candidacy, expecting Addicks' house of money to collapse. But to Henry's surprise, Addicks' camp suffered only one desertion. It was still a deadlock. DuPont was furious, and he was just as stubborn as Addicks, and he had more money. At this point, either DuPont or Addicks, depending on whom one takes as a source, but probably Addicks, made a statement that would resound in infamy through Delaware's history to this day. Me or nobody. Delaware got nobody. The personal feud between DuPont and Addicks would keep Delaware from being fully represented in the U.S. Senate for 12 long years. One and only one, each insisted, would be the victor, and Delaware was the loser. After 35 ballots, the Speaker of the Senate, William T. Watson, declared no election, and he adjourned the legislature. DuPont was outraged. He insisted he would have his election. He got the Speaker of the House to declare that Watson's decision was invalid. The grounds were amazing. During the balloting, Governor Marvell had died, and Watson, as Speaker of the Senate, succeeded him under the state constitution. But the Constitution did not prohibit Watson from continuing on as Speaker of the Senate, so he did, casting his ballots during the election. At no time was his vote ever challenged. But after his ruling on the U.S. Senate vote, DuPont forces, including the Speaker of the House, declared Watson had no right to rule as Speaker of the Senate, and declared both his ruling and his right to vote invalid. That gave Henry the majority he needed. The Speaker of the House issued a certificate of election, and Henry DuPont moved to Washington, demanding the Senate seat for himself. Delaware was shocked by DuPont's chicanery. The Wilmington every evening repeated Watson's right to vote. The country was also shocked. The Philadelphia Public Ledger reiterated the position of the Wilmington paper, and even the New York Times charged that Watson's voting rights and ruling were, quote, according to the state constitution and laws of all precedents in the state, end quote. And apparently the U.S. Senate agreed. On 15 May 1896, the Senate voted to deny the seat to DuPont and sent him packing. Colonel Henry returned to Wilmington a bitter man. For 10 more years, he waged a relentless war for that Senate seat. Now, in 1898, war veteran Colonel Henry DuPont's image was boosted when he was awarded the Medal of Honor for his heroism during the Civil War Battle of Cedar Creek. The medal was a little late, 34 years to be exact, but this was typical for the times. As the Medal of Honor had grown in familiarity and admiration, aging Civil War veterans wrote to officials at the Record and Pension Office within the Adjutant General's office requesting the medal. As a result, between 1891 and 1900, more than 500 Medals of Honor were awarded for actions during the Civil War. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain of Maine received his Medal of Honor in 1897 for his activities at Little Round Top in 1863. Laurel Hill East Frank Furness received his in 1899 for actions during the Battle of Trevilian Station in 1864. This was also a time when newspaper headlines were warning, war is now inevitable, in a run-up to the Spanish-American conflict. And the government needed good relationships with the DuPonts because they were the munitions manufacturers that would sell to the government at reasonable rates for the upcoming war with Spain and expansion overseas. And Henry proudly wore his Medal of Honor at all public appearances. But the following year, Addicks controlled 21 of 50 votes in the legislature. DuPont held only 8. But the colonel had inherited his father's stubbornness. Now it was definitely Henry who cried, "Me or nobody." In 1901, Addicks had 22 votes, and again, Henry's hard-headedness denied Delaware its right to Senate representation. And for the next 2 years, Delaware had no representative at all in the U.S. Senate. By 1903, Delaware had become a national laughingstock and a scandal. Under pressure applied by President Theodore Roosevelt, compromise senators James Frank Ali and L. Heister Ball were selected for the remaining Senate terms. By 1905, however, the feud was renewed for one of the seats, and still a deadlock persisted. The stubborn Henry DuPont of Delaware refused to surrender, especially when he was about to bring up his biggest gun, his first cousin, T. Coleman DuPont, president of the DuPont Company. With Coleman DuPont, Gas Addicks finally met his match. Coley's first move was to smash Addicks' machine by luring his hacks away with bribes. Henry gave thousands of dollars to Sussex County Republicans. Coleman then had George Kennan, the old secretary for deceased Lamont DuPont, 1831 to 1884, write a now famous article in Outlook magazine. George Kennan, by the way, was no relation to the 20th century globe-trotting presidential consultant of the same name. The title of this 3-part article was Holding Up a State. It details the story of Gas Addicks, bribe after bribe, and scandal after scandal. Coleman was as efficient in organizing the campaign as he was ruthless in his threats. Henry felt things were going so well, he sailed off on a European cruise to relax his nerves. And in June, Addicks announced he was pulling out in the interest of the Republican Party. His 12-year hold on the party smashed in one short year by T. Coleman DuPont. On 12 June, the Republican caucus nominated Henry DuPont by a vote of 20 to 10, and he was now a U.S. Senator. 8 hours before DuPont's swearing in, Addicks boarded a Dover train bound for New York. He never returned to Delaware. He had failed in 4 separate attempts to become a senator from Delaware. The copper market soon fell as the 1907 Depression began, and Addicks' fortune disappeared. As Henry DuPont now sat in the halls of federal government, suddenly, for some strange reason, the federal government began to hound Addicks right out of business. A legal fight arose out of his gas deals and resulted in a federal court awarding $4 million against him. Addicks was reduced to hiding from subpoenas, living in poverty, and the hunt went on. 2 years after his defeat in Delaware, process servers found him in a dreary Hoboken tenement, living under an assumed name. His gas and light were turned off for non-payment by a company that he had once owned. For 11 more years, the harassment went on. In 1919, the New York Times published an article headlined, "Gasman held a prisoner for 2 hours in Sheriff Harburger's office. 3-year hunt for him." The article noted that he had been sought for default on a $20,000 promissory note and that he was, quote, looking pale and worn and wearing a smeared drab raincoat. He had no lawyer. He called his brother to help him make bond. Gas Addicks died at 328 West 57th Street in New York City at the home of his doctor, Rita Dunleavy, on 7 August 1919, a forgotten and broken man. He was buried in a still unmarked grave at Laurel Hill East in the chapel section. His story is known to few except possibly Delaware historians. You've been listening to an excerpt from the podcast All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 49, White Collar Crime. If you want to hear more about other questionable activities, Check out All Bones Considered number 28. It's called Bad Science. Stories about ethnologist Dr. Samuel George Morton, grave robber George Glidden, and phony inventor John Ernst Worrell Keeley. Also, All Bones Considered number 46, Fathers of American Medicine Part 3, Some Ethical Dilemmas, about Dr. George McClellan and the founding of medical schools, William Henry Pancoast and involuntary insemination, and Samuel McClintock Hamel, who experimented on orphan infants. All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories, and biographical bites from Bala, Laurel Hill West Stories, are available wherever you listen to podcasts.